At 61, Ruth Halloran had $310, one hard-sided suitcase, and a car that smelled of the coffee she had spilled somewhere near the county line. 34 years of marriage had ended in a conference room with good carpet, and she had walked out of it owning less than she had brought in. She did not cry in the parking garage. She had done her crying earlier, in stages, over the 11 months it took Gerald and his brother to take the house, the accounts, and the small teaching pension she had thought was hers alone. By the time the papers were signed, there was nothing left to grieve but the arithmetic. $310. A suitcase. A 2003 Mercury Sable with 187,000 miles and a check engine light that had been on so long she thought of it as company. There was one thing they had not wanted. One thing Dale had waved off in the settlement as worthless. A line item on a page, appraised at $4,000 and located, as he put it, in the middle of nowhere. Ruth's mother had left it to her in a will 2 winters before. A one-room schoolhouse on a gravel road in Cade County, boarded up for 30 years, its bell long silent, its windows gone to plywood and dust. Everyone agreed it was worthless. Ruth drove 3 hours to see it because it was the only thing in the world that was hers. She did not yet know about the wall in the cloakroom. She did not know what her mother had hidden behind it, or how many people in that county owed a debt they had never been allowed to name. The lawyers had called it nothing. It would turn out to be the only fortune that had ever mattered. The end of the marriage did not arrive with shouting. That was the part Ruth kept returning to, later, when she tried to explain it to herself. It arrived with paperwork, and with the particular politeness of men who have already won. She had married Gerald Halloran at 27, in a church in the city, in a dress her mother had sewn by hand and mailed in a box lined with tissue. For 34 years she had been a wife, the way you are a road you drive every day and never look at. She had taught, off and on, as a substitute, 3rd grade, 5th grade, the long gray middle school afternoons, filling in for teachers who were sick or grieving or simply gone. It never paid much. She had put what she earned into an account she believed was jointly hers, and she had trusted Gerald with the rest because trusting him had been easier than the alternative, and because for a long time there had been no alternative worth naming. Gerald's brother Dale was a lawyer. He had drawn up their wills, their refinance, the small trust that held the house. Ruth had signed where the little colored tabs told her to sign. She had signed at the kitchen table with the coffee going cold, half listening, because Dale talked fast and used words that were built to be nodded at rather than understood. She had signed, over the years, a great many pages she never read. That was how they took everything. Not in a single theft, but in a slow one, spread across a decade of tabs and initials, until the day Gerald sat her down and told her, in the flat voice of a man reading a weather report, that he wanted a divorce, that the house was held in a trust, that the trust was structured a certain way, and that Dale would handle it so there would be no ugliness. There was no ugliness. There was only a conference room. Ruth remembered the carpet because she had spent a great deal of time looking at it. It was gray with a faint blue fleck, the kind of carpet chosen so that nothing would ever show a stain. Dale sat across from her in a good suit and slid papers over the table one at a time. He explained the trust the way you explain a card trick after it is done, when the explaining is just another way of showing you how badly you were fooled. The house was not hers. It had never been hers. Not since the refinance in 2011, the one she had signed at the kitchen table with the cold coffee. The retirement account was Gerald's, held under his name, with her as a beneficiary who had just been quietly removed. The pension from her substitute years had been rolled, at some point, into an instrument she did not understand, and the instrument was inside the trust, and the trust was Gerald's. "You'll want your own counsel," Dale said, which was the closest thing to a kindness he offered, and he offered it knowing she could not afford it. She asked how much there would be. She hated herself for asking, but she was 61 and she needed to know the shape of the ground she was about to fall on. Dale did the arithmetic without looking at his notes. After the marital debt was assigned, after the equalization, after the fees, Ruth would leave the marriage with the contents of one checking account. $310. He said the number the same way he had said all the other numbers. Gerald did not come to the conference room. He had sent his brother the way you send a man to put down a dog you have loved but no longer want to feed. Ruth thought about that later, too. 34 years, and he could not sit in the room. There was one more page. Dale slid it across last, almost as an afterthought, and for the first time his mouth moved towards something like a smile. It was the disposition of a property in Cade County, a schoolhouse, deeded to Ruth by her late mother, Cora Dunmore, and appraised by the county at $4,000. Dale said the trust made no claim on it. He said the word worthless out loud, twice, the way you drive a nail. He said the land was too far out to develop, and the building was condemned in all but the paperwork, and that Ruth was welcome to it. He said she'd probably owe back taxes on it that ran to more than it was worth. "Sign here," he said, and pointed to the little colored tab. "And it's all yours," Ruth signed. Her hand did not shake. She noticed that it did not shake, and she held on to that small fact like a coin in a pocket. She stood and thanked them out of a lifetime of habit, and hated the thanking. She took the elevator down and found her car in the garage and sat behind the wheel of the Mercury for a long time without starting it. The check engine light was on, $310 in the account. One suitcase in the trunk, packed the week before by a woman who was still hoping, a little, that none of this would happen. She was 61 years old, and she had one thing left in the world that no one else had wanted. She started the car, and she drove toward it. Cade County was 3 hours south and a little west of the city, down through the last of the interstate, and then onto 2-lane roads that got narrower as they got older. Ruth drove with the windows cracked because the Mercury's air conditioning had died the summer before, and the June air came in warm and green and smelling of cut hay. She had 160 miles to think, and she spent most of them not thinking, which was its own kind of work. She had not been to Verbena in 9 years. She had come down for her mother's funeral 2 winters ago. But that had been a single gray day, in and out, a rented sedan and a motel by the highway, and a casserole's worth of people she half recognized. She had not gone out to the schoolhouse then. She had not been able to. Her mother had taught in that room for 38 years, and the thought of standing in it with Cora gone had been more than Ruth could carry on a funeral weekend, so she had signed the papers the lawyer sent and driven back to the city and to a marriage that, she saw now, had already begun quietly to eat her. The town had not changed much. A feed store, a Baptist church with a new metal roof, a diner called the Bluebird, a gas station where a boy of maybe 19 sat on an overturned bucket watching her Mercury go by. Ruth followed the county road out past the last of the houses, past a Christmas tree farm gone wild, and turned where she remembered turning, onto Hollow Road, which was gravel now and had probably always been gravel. The schoolhouse sat at the top of a low rise where 2 fields met, and the sight of it stopped her breath in a way she had not been ready for. It was smaller than she remembered, the way all childhood things are. A single room of whitewashed board gone gray, with a peaked roof and a little square belfry at the front, empty now, the bell taken down or stolen years ago. The windows on the near side were boarded with plywood that had warped and silvered in the weather. The front steps had rotted through in the middle. A hackberry tree had grown up close against the east wall and dropped 30 years of leaves into the gutters until they became soil, and out of that soil a whole small garden of weeds now grew along the roofline. The paint had peeled back to bare wood in long curls. Somewhere a loose sheet of tin lifted and knocked in the wind and lay back down. Ruth parked the Mercury in the grass and sat looking at it. $4,000, the county said. Worthless, Dale said. Her mother had walked up those steps 5,000 mornings. She got out. The grass came up past her knees, seeded and dry, and grasshoppers scattered ahead of her feet. The front door was locked, but the lock was rusted through, and the door itself had swollen in its frame, so that she had to put her shoulder to it twice before it gave with a sound like something waking up. Inside, the light came down in bars through the gaps in the plywood, thick with dust, and the smell was of old wood and mouse and chalk. Chalk, after 30 years. Ruth stood in the doorway and breathed it in. The room was as her mother had left it. That was the thing that undid her. Not ruin, not vandalism. The county was too far out and the road too poor for either. but a kind of held breath. Rows of small desks, iron-framed, the wood tops carved with the initials of children who would now be old. A wood stove in the center with its pipe going up through the roof. A globe on a shelf, furred gray with dust, showing countries that no longer existed. On the wall, a long slate chalkboard, and above it, in a faded strip of paper, the alphabet in a careful looping hand, capital and small, a through Z, that Ruth knew at once, without any doubt, was her mother's. The room was full of small stopped clocks. On the big slate at the front, under 30 years of settled dust, Ruth could still make out the ghost of the last lesson, a column of spelling words in her mother's hand, harvest, lantern, patience, and a date chalked in the corner that she had to lean close to read, and that she did not let herself say aloud. On the teacher's desk lay the attendance register, open, a pen laid across the crease as though set down for a moment. A stub of chalk sat in the tray, worn to the length of a thumbnail. On one of the iron hooks in the cloakroom, a child's coat still hung, moth-eaten to lace, red once, and beneath it a tin lunch pail with a name scratched into the lid that Ruth would look for, later, in the ledgers, and find. The whole room had the feeling of a breath held for 3 decades, waiting to be let out, and on the teacher's chair, set neatly in the seat where a person might have left them a moment before stepping out, was a pair of child's shoes. They were brown leather, scuffed at the toes, laces still tied, no bigger than Ruth's 2 hands together. Small enough for a first grader. They had been sitting on that chair for 30 years, waiting for a child who had grown up and grown old and maybe died, and Ruth could not, for the life of her, understand why they were there, or whose they had been, or why her mother had set them on her own chair, as though they were the most important thing in the room. She would understand, later. She did not understand then. She only stood in the barred light with her mother's chalkboard and her mother's alphabet and a dead child's shoes, and for the second time that day she found that her hands were not shaking, and she held on to that. She slept in the schoolhouse that first night because she had nowhere else and no money for anywhere else. She counted it out on the teacher's desk by the light of her phone, $310 in the account, and in her wallet, in cash, $41 and some change. The mercury had a little under half a tank. She had eaten a gas station sandwich at 2 o'clock, and she was not hungry, which was good, because being not hungry was free. She swept a space clear at the back of the room with a broom she found in the cloakroom, its straw worn to a stub, and she laid out the quilt from her suitcase on the floorboards. The boards were wide and old and worn smooth in a path down the center aisle where 38 years of children had walked to the front and back again. She lay on the quilt and listened to the building. It talked all night, the tin lifting and knocking, the hackberry scraping the east wall, mice in the walls going about their business, and under all of it a deep settling silence that was not empty so much as attended, as though the room were used to being full and was only waiting. She did not sleep much. In the morning her back ached and her mouth was dry, and there was a dead cold in her chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. She sat up in the gray light and looked at the rows of little desks and asked herself, out loud, in the empty room, what exactly she thought she was doing. The answer was that she did not know. But there was a well behind the schoolhouse with a hand pump, and after 20 minutes of working the handle it coughed and gave up water. Rusty at first, and then clear and cold, and Ruth drank from her cupped hands and washed her face, and the not knowing got a little smaller. She drove into Verbena that morning and spent $4.11 at the grocery on a loaf of bread, a jar of peanut butter, a bag of apples, and a box of powdered milk, doing the math in her head at the shelf the way she had not had to do since she was a girl. The woman at the register looked at her a beat too long, the way people in small towns look at a face they can almost place, and said nothing. They all did that, those first days. Ruth felt the town watching her. Not unkindly, but warily, the way you watch weather coming. She was a stranger in a good coat, driving a bad car, living, apparently, out at the old Hollow Road School, and Verbena did not yet know what to make of her. At the diner, a man tipped his cap and did not smile. At the gas station, the boy on the bucket watched her pump $6 of gas and said nothing. Ruth understood. She had been that kind of careful herself, once, about people who arrived out of nowhere with sadness on them. She made the room livable a little at a time, because a little at a time was all she could afford. The hardware store on the square sold her a box of galvanized nails for $1.40 and a claw hammer, used, for $3, and with them she pulled the rotten center tread off the front steps and cut a replacement from a floorboard she pried up in the cloakroom where no one would ever walk again. She planed the swollen front door with a rusted rasp until it closed without her shoulder. She swept the mouse dirt out of the wood stove and found the flue rusted shut, so she did not light it, and on the cool nights she wore the coat that had followed her out of the marriage and slept in it. She washed her 2 changes of clothes in the well water in a galvanized bucket and hung them on the belfry rope to dry. Every purchase came out of the same shrinking number, and every night she wrote the number down on the back of a grocery receipt with a stub of her mother's chalkbox pencil. The way, she thought, her mother must have kept accounts once. $1.40 for nails, $3 for the hammer, $4 and $11 for food, $6 for gas, subtracting, always subtracting, watching the figure walk down toward a place she did not let herself look at directly. The nights were the hardest part. The June days were long and warm and full of work. There was always something to do. A window to unboard, a floor to sweep, the pump to coax. But when the light went, the schoolhouse got large and cold around her, and Ruth would lie on her quilt in the dark and add the numbers up again in her head. 310 becoming 280, the tank going from half to a quarter. And she would think about what a person actually does when the money runs all the way out. She had no plan. She had a building she could not sell, appraised at $4,000, that would cost more than that to make fit to live in, and a car she did not trust to make the drive back to the city, even if there had been anything to drive back to. She made herself say it plainly, out of road. She had been a wife and a substitute teacher for 34 years, and she had ended those years lying on the floor of an abandoned schoolhouse counting single dollars. And the strange thing, the thing she could not explain to herself, was that she was less afraid out here with nothing than she had been for years in a house with everything. She ate bread and peanut butter for supper, standing in the schoolhouse door, watching the light go long and gold across the fields. And that was when the dog came. He came up out of the tree line at the bottom of the rise, low and slow, a brown dog gone gray at the muzzle, ribs showing, one ear torn. He stopped 40 feet off and looked at her, and Ruth looked back and did not move. She had no idea whose he was or whether he had ever been anyone's. She tore a corner off her bread and set it on the bottom step and went back inside. And in the morning the bread was gone, and the dog was lying in the tall grass by the mercury with his chin on his paws, watching the door. He would not let her touch him for 3 days. On the 4th he let her, and by the end of the first week he slept inside on the far end of her quilt and followed her when she walked the property, and Ruth, who had not named a living thing in 34 years, called him Chalk, because he was the gray-brown color of a stub of it, and because it was the smell of the room he had decided to live in. She was down to $291 in the account and $31 in cash. She did not know what she was going to do, but she was not, she realized, alone anymore, and she had not expected that to matter as much as it did. The postmaster found her on the 9th day. She had gone into town to ask, at the little brick post office, whether there was any way to have mail held for her, since the schoolhouse had no box and no address that the modern world recognized. The man behind the counter was old, well past 70, tall and stooped with a white mustache and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. And when Ruth said her name, Ruth Dunmore, she said, using her mother's name without deciding to, Ruth Dunmore Halloran, the man went very still. Dunmore, he said. You'd be Cora's girl. I would, Ruth said. The man took the glasses off his forehead and set them on the counter and looked at her for a long moment, and Ruth saw, to her surprise, that his eyes had filled. He introduced himself as Elias Cobb. He had run the Verbena post office for 41 years and had kept coming in 3 mornings a week after he retired because, he said, a man had to have somewhere to go. He asked after the schoolhouse. Ruth told him she was living in it, and braced for the look people gave her when she said that. But Elias Cobb did not give her that look. He gave her a different one entirely. "She teach you to read?" he asked. "Your mother?" "She did," Ruth said. "I was small." Elias Cobb nodded slowly. "She taught me to read," he said. "When I was 40 years old, Ruth did not know what to say. She stood at the counter of the little post office and waited, because it was plain the old man had more to say and had been waiting a long time to say it. He told her, in pieces, over the next half hour, with 2 people coming and going for stamps in the middle of it. He had grown up on a tobacco place east of town, the oldest of 9, and had been put to the fields at 8 and never gone past the 2nd grade. He had spent his whole young life hiding it. The way, he said, that a man hides a limp, walking careful so nobody sees. He had gotten the postmaster job on the strength of a cousin's word and a good memory, and for years he had sorted the mail by the shape of the names in the towns because he could not truly read them, matching patterns like a man doing a jigsaw in the dark, terrified every single day that someone would find him out. And then one night, he said, somebody told me about Cora Dunmore. He had gone out to the Hollow Road School after dark, the first time, and parked down the road and walked up so nobody would see his truck. There had been a lamp in the window. Inside, at the little desks built for children, sat 4 grown men and 2 women, and Cora Dunmore at the front with her chalk, teaching the alphabet to people old enough to be her own age. She had not made a thing of it when Elias came in. She had found him a desk and a primer, and started him where he was, which was nowhere. And she had never once let him feel ashamed. 3 years I went out there, 2 nights a week, Elias said. 1962 to 65. She never took a dime. I offered. I about begged her to let me pay her something. She wouldn't hear it, she said. And here the old man's voice went, and he had to stop and put his glasses back on and take them off again before he could go on. She said the reading wasn't hers to sell. Said somebody gave it to her once and she was just passing it down the line. Ruth stood very still. She was thinking of the alphabet on the strip of paper above the chalkboard. She was thinking of the child's shoes on the chair. There's a good many of us, Elias said. More than you'd think. She never said who came out there, and we never said either. Not to each other, not for years. It wasn't a thing you talked about. But I'd guess. He stopped and did the arithmetic slowly, the way a man does who learned his numbers late and cherishes them. I'd guess 1/3 of this town, the old part of it, my age and up, learned their letters in that room at night. And not a one of us ever knew where she got the money. What money? Ruth said. Elias Cobb looked at her carefully then, as though deciding something. She wasn't who folks thought she was, he said finally. A country school teacher on a country school teacher's pay. That's what everybody saw. But there was more to Cora than that, and more to that building, and I always figured she left the knowing of it to whoever loved her enough to come looking. He put his glasses in his shirt pocket. You're living in it, he said. Seems to me you ought to look. He would not say more than that. Ruth drove back out to Hollow Road with her heart going in a way it had not gone in years, and Chalk met the car in the grass, and she stood in the doorway of her mother's schoolroom and looked at it as though for the first time. Look, the old man had said. So she looked. She spent 2 days looking before she found it, and she found it by accident, the way she supposed her mother had meant for it to be found. Not by a thief or a lawyer, but by someone with time and love and no particular hurry. The cloakroom was a narrow space at the front of the schoolhouse, off to the side of the entry, where 38 years of children had hung their coats on a row of iron hooks and left their lunch pails on a shelf. The back wall of the cloakroom was a chalkboard, a second, smaller slate than the big one in the main room, mounted flush, its surface gone chalk white and ghosted with the faint shapes of old lessons. Ruth had leaned on it a dozen times without a thought. But on the second evening, moving the coat hooks to clean behind them, her hand pressed the board's lower left corner and she felt it give, just slightly, just a fraction, with a small hollow knock behind it that no wall against solid ground should ever make. She stood back. She looked at the chalkboard the way you look at a face you thought you knew. Then she got her fingers into the seam along the bottom, where the slate met the baseboard, and she pulled. The whole board swung out on hinges she had never seen, greased once long ago and stiff now, groaning. It was not a wall. It had never been a wall. It was a door her mother had built to look like the least interesting surface in the building, and behind it was a space the size of a large closet, dry and dark and untouched. And in the beam of Ruth's phone she saw shelves, and on the shelves, in ranks, the spines of ledgers, dozens of them, scores of them, and in the center of the little room, a teacher's desk, oak, roll-topped, locked. Ruth sat down on the cloakroom floor because her legs would not hold her, and chalk came and pressed against her side, and for a while she just looked into the dark at all those books. Then she reached in and took down the first ledger, and opened it, and began to read. The first ones were attendance books. That was all, at first, cloth-bound, the size of a hymnal, one for each year, and Ruth found the oldest at the bottom of the stack and worked forward in time. 1951, 1952. Each page a grid in her mother's careful looping hand. The children's names down the left, the school days across the top, a neat mark for present, a small O for absent, the whole thing footed and totaled at the month's end the way the county required. Ruth turned the pages by phone light and read the names of children long grown: Renfrew, Pyle, Boyd, Suggs, Cobb, the same last names she had seen on the mailboxes and the storefronts of Verbena 3 and 4 generations back. It was ordinary. It was a schoolteacher's records, kept because the state made her keep them. Ruth almost felt foolish. She had expected. She did not know what she had expected. She kept reading only because it was her mother's hand and she could not stop touching it. And yet, reading closely, she began to see the small things her mother had noticed that the county never asked her to. In the margins beside certain names there were faint pencil notes, so light they had almost lifted off the page. Beside a boy named Tolliver, October of 1955, absent 3 weeks, tobacco, no coat. Beside a girl named Rennick, February of 1957, cannot see the board, sits her at the front. Beside a Boyd child, a whole run of small O's for absent through the spring of 1953. And then, in the same faint pencil, the single word walks. The boy had no way to get the 4 miles in. And so, Ruth understood. Her mother had somehow seen to it that he did. 30 and 40 years on, the marks were still there. A schoolteacher counting not attendance but need. Keeping in pencil the ledger the state did not know it wanted. Then, near the back of the 1958 book, tucked between the last attendance page and the cover, she found a second set of rolls, folded on different paper. They were not children. The names were the same last names, some of them, but the entries beside them were wrong for children. Age, one column said, and the ages ran from 22 to 68. Occupation, said another. Farmer, hand, mill, wife, hauler, widow. And a third column, headed in her mother's hand with 3 words that made the hair stand up on Ruth's arms, letters known, start, beside each name a number, 0, 0, 4, 0, 11. And a fourth column, filled in later in darker ink, letters known, now, 26, 26, 26. Ruth understood then what she was holding. These were the night rolls. The grown men and women who had come up Hollow Road in the dark, the way Elias Cobb had come, parking down the road so no one would see, to sit at a child's desk and learn the alphabet from a woman who would not take their money. Her mother had kept a record of every one. Not for the county never knew. She had kept it for herself, or for God, or for exactly this, for someone, someday, to find and to understand what had happened in this room after the children went home. She read the names slowly, and they were not names to her yet, only strangers in a column, but the numbers beside them told a whole life in 3 figures. A man named Del Prentice, age 51, hauler, letters known at start, 6. Beside him, in the darker later ink, letters known now, 26 and a date, and the word Bible, as though the first thing the man had wanted to read, once he could, was the one book in his house. A woman named Iva Renfrew, age 38, widow, who had started at 0 in the autumn of 1959 and whom the ledger followed for 2 winters until the column read 26 and, beside it, reads the seed catalogs now, orders her own. There was a note in one place that turned Ruth cold and then warm. Beside a man's name in 1963, letters known now, 26, and after it, in the plainest hand, first time he signed his own name, he cried, and so did I. Ruth read night rolls until her phone died. There were hundreds of names across the years. She counted the folded sheets, and there were 61 of them, one for nearly every year her mother taught, and each sheet held anywhere from 4 to 19 grown students, so that the arithmetic of it, when Ruth finally let herself do the arithmetic, ran past 400 adults taught to read in a room built for children, after dark, for nothing. She sat in the dark of the cloakroom, then, unable to see, with the ledgers all around her and the desk locked in the center of them, and she wept. Not from grief this time, or not only. She wept because she had spent 61 years thinking she knew who her mother was, a quiet countrywoman with chalk dust on her sleeves, and she had been wrong, and the being wrong was the most wonderful thing that had happened to her in years. She read for a week. She rationed her phone battery and then bought a second-hand lantern at the feed store for $6. And she read by lantern light the way, she supposed, the night students had, and the reading changed her. Behind the night rolls, on a lower shelf, she found the shoe boxes. Not children's shoes. Receipts. 3 cardboard boxes packed tight with slips of paper, decades of them, and Ruth spread them out on the cloakroom floor and read them one by one until she understood the second thing her mother had hidden. They were receipts for shoes. Children's shoes. From the dry goods store in town, dozens and dozens of pairs across the years, each one paid in cash. Receipts for eyeglasses, ground, and fitted by an optometrist 2 counties over, a girl named Suggs, 1961, nearsighted, could not read the board. A boy named Pyle, 1966, who the note said had been squinting at his primer and holding it an inch from his nose. Receipts from the Verbena grocery for standing accounts, lunch, it said in her mother's hand beside each one, and a child's initials, month after month, for children whose families could not send them to school with anything to eat. And on the back of each receipt, where a person might sign, her mother had written, every time, in the same 2 words, the same looping hand, a friend. Ruth read them until she lost the light and then lit the lantern and read them by that. A pair of children's Oxfords, brown, size 2, from the dry goods store, October of 1960, $1.85, and on the back, a child's initials and a friend. A pair of galoshes, February of 1962, 90 cents. A winter coat, wool, boys size 10, $4.50, November of 1964, and Ruth thought of the pencil note beside the Tolliver boy, no coat, and understood that her mother had not just written the need down, she had answered it, 4 years running, out of a salary that in those years would not have cleared $2,800 in a good year. There were eyeglass bills from the optometrist in the next county over, made out in full, $6 and $7 a pair, one of them for a girl named Suggs in 1961 and another for a boy named Pyle in 1966. There were slips from the Verbena grocery. A running lunch account carried month to month, 40 and 50 cents at a time, for children whose initials repeated down the years until the initials grew up and stopped, and beside each closed account her mother had drawn a small line and written done, the way you finish a thing you promised yourself you would finish. And on every last one of them, in place of a signature, the same 2 words. Not her name. Never her name. A friend. Ruth sat among the paper and did the arithmetic she could not help doing. The arithmetic of a woman down to $280 who knew exactly what a schoolteacher made. Her mother had earned almost nothing. Cora Dunmore had raised a daughter alone on a substitute-and-a-half's country salary, had worn the same brown coat for 20 years, had darned and saved and gone without. And out of that nothing, that carefully counted nothing, she had bought 30 years of shoes and eyeglasses and school lunches for other people's children, and she had signed it a friend so that not one of them would ever have to carry the weight of being pitied. The shoes on the chair. Ruth understood the shoes on the chair now, or thought she did. Somewhere there had been a child too poor for shoes, and her mother had bought that child a pair, and kept a pair on her own chair ever after, A reminder, maybe, or a promise, set where she would see it every morning of her working life. No child in this county, Ruth remembered her mother saying once, long ago, when Ruth was small and had complained about walking to school. No child in this county goes without if I can help it. Ruth had thought it was just something mothers said. She had not known it was a vow. She found out where the vow came from on a slip of paper that was not a receipt, folded into the bottom of the last box, a page in her mother's hand, older than the rest, the ink gone brown. Cora had written it to no one, or to herself. Ruth read it twice, standing, and then she had to sit. Taken out of school at 9 years old to work the neighbor's tobacco, her mother had written, could not read my own name till I was 19. A woman named Miss Elder taught me nights, and would not take my money, and said only that I should pass it on. I have tried to pass it on. God knows I have tried. Let no child in Cade County go unlettered while I have breath and a lamp. Ruth put the page down. She sat in the schoolhouse her mother had built into a lantern for a whole county, and she saw the shape of the thing at last, a chain of women, each pulled out of the light too young, each dragged back into it by a stranger who asked for nothing, each swearing to do the same. Miss Elder to Cora. Cora to a third of the town. And now, in a locked desk in the center of the little dark room, whatever her mother had meant to hand to Ruth. Because there was still the desk, roll-topped, oak, and locked, and Ruth had no key. She did not get to open it before the trouble came. She was still looking for the key. She had been through the main desk, the wood stove's cold belly, the belfry with its missing bell, when a black car she did not recognize came up Hollow Road in a plume of gravel dust, and Chalk stood up in the grass and began, low, to growl. It was Dale. Ruth watched him get out of the car in his good shoes and pick his way through the tall grass with distaste, and behind him a second man, younger, with a leather folder under his arm, and Ruth knew the type before she knew the name. Another lawyer. Dale had brought another lawyer. "Ruth," Dale said, when he was close enough, and he smiled the conference room smile. "You're a hard woman to find." She did not invite him in. They stood in the yard, the four of them counting the dog, and Dale explained, in the fast nodding at language she remembered too well, why he had driven 3 hours to a place he had called worthless to her face. Somebody had come sniffing around, was how it started. Dale did not say who, but Ruth would learn later it was a developer out of the city, a company called Ridgeline that bought up cheap rural acreage and sat on it, and that a surveyor working the county had noticed the Hollow Road parcel and the road frontage, and the fact that the state was, in 3 years, going to run a new bypass through the bottom of that very field. The land was not worthless. The land had never been quite worthless, and it was about to be worth a great deal, and Dale, who read every filing, who missed nothing, who had built a career on knowing the value of things before the people who owned them did, had found out. "There's an offer," the younger lawyer said, and opened his folder, and Ruth saw the number before he said it. A developer's letter of intent. For the parcel, the building, and the surrounding 11 acres, Ridgeline was prepared to pay $190,000. $190,000. To a woman with $280 in the bank. Ruth felt the number go through her like cold water. She understood, standing in the grass with the developer's letter of intent open in the younger man's hand, exactly how the trick worked, because it was the same trick as the conference room, only run backward. In the conference room, the number had been small, so she would sign it away. Here the number was enormous, so she would sign it away. Either way, the point was the paper and the little colored tab, and either way, the man holding the pen already knew what she would decide before she did. That was Dale's gift, the only one he had. He did not read people. He read the paper, and the paper always won. "Now here's the trouble," Dale said, and his voice changed, went gentle in the way that was worse than cruel. "The will," he said, "was defective. Cora Dunmore had drawn it up herself, years ago, with a form from a stationery store and 2 witnesses who were both now dead, and there were problems. The legal description of the property was old and did not match the current survey. The witnessing might not hold. There was a question, Dale said, about whether Cora had been of sound mind in her last years, a woman living alone, a woman who, people would say, had grown eccentric, secretive, who had boarded up a schoolhouse and kept it like a shrine. A court could set that will aside, Dale said. And if it does, that property passes by intestacy, and given how the family's structured, given the trust, that's a fight you cannot afford and cannot win. He let it sit. Then he offered his kindness, the way he always did, at the exact moment it would cut deepest. "Or," he said, "you sign the parcel over to me now, and I see that you get a piece of the Ridgeline money, a fair piece. Enough to start over. Nobody has to go to court, and nobody has to go through your mother's competence in front of a judge. You don't want that, Ruth. You don't want them saying those things about Cora in a courtroom. Let me handle it. Sign here." He had a page ready. Of course he had a page ready. He held out a pen and pointed, out of 34 years of habit, to a little colored tab. Ruth looked at the tab. She looked at the schoolhouse behind him, at the boarded windows and the empty belfry and the peeled gray paint, and she thought of the receipts on the floor of the cloakroom, 3 cardboard boxes of them, every one signed a friend. She thought of Elias Cobb's voice breaking over the word, passing it down the line. She thought of 40 years of a man hiding a limp so nobody would see. "No," she said. Dale's smile did not move, but something behind it did. "Ruth, you called it worthless," she said. "You said the word twice. You made me sign it away for nothing so you wouldn't have to split it, and now you've driven 3 hours to steal it back because you found out what it's worth." She was not shaking. She noticed, again, that she was not shaking. "You don't know the half of what it's worth, and you're not getting it." She turned and went up the freshly mended steps and into her mother's schoolroom and shut the plain door without needing her shoulder now. And she stood in the barred light with her heart going and listened to the black car turn around in the gravel and drive away. And she knew, the way you know weather, that it was not over. Dale did not lose. Dale had never in his life lost. He would go back to the city and he would file something, and he would come back with a court behind him, and he would take this the way he had taken everything else, slowly, on paper, with her signature somewhere in the middle of it. He filed it 11 days later. Ruth learned the shape of it from a manila envelope left in the diner for her by a process server who could not find the schoolhouse. A petition, styled in re the estate of Cora Dunmore, to set aside the will for defective execution and want of testamentary capacity, with a hearing set for the last Tuesday in July, 6 weeks out. She read it twice at the counter of the Bluebird with a cup of coffee going cold in front of her, the way she had once read papers at a kitchen table, except that this time she read every word. Half of it she did not understand. But she understood the part where Dale's firm, on behalf of the trust, asked the court to declare that a woman who had taught 400 people to read had not been of sound enough mind to leave her own daughter a $4,000 schoolhouse. She understood that they meant to say it out loud, in a courtroom, about Cora, that they were counting on Ruth to fold rather than let them. She sat with the cold coffee a long time. Then she paid her $1 for it and drove back out to Hollow Road and did not fold. Unless she found, before he did, whatever her mother had locked in that desk. She found the key that night, and she found it because of the shoes. She had been through everything else. She had pried at the desk's lock with a butter knife until she was ashamed of herself, had run her hands along the underside of every shelf, had stood in the belfry again in the dark. And then, coming back in, her lantern swung across the teacher's chair, and the small brown shoes sitting on it where they had sat for 30 years, and Ruth stopped. She had not touched them. In all her weeks in the room, she had left them exactly as her mother had left them, out of a feeling she could not name. Now she crossed to the chair and picked one up, and it was lighter and older in her hand than she expected. The leather cracked, the laces stiff, and when she turned it over and worked her finger down into the toe, past a wad of 30-year-old newspaper, she felt something small and hard and cold. A key. A little brass desk key, wrapped in a slip of paper, and on the paper, in her mother's hand. For whoever loves this room enough to look after it. The rest is yours to keep or to give. I have kept it for the giving. Ruth carried the key to the cloakroom and knelt at the roll-top desk and fitted it to the lock. And it turned, and the timbre rolled back with a soft wooden clatter, and there, in the pigeonholes in the single-wide drawer, was the last of it. The thing the attendance books and the night rolls and the receipts had all been leading to. The thing her mother had built a false wall to protect and hidden the key inside a dead child's shoe to keep. It was a ledger, bound in black, and on the first page, in the careful looping hand, her mother had written a title, "Those I Have Seen Through." It was a list of names, 40 of them, numbered, running across 40 years, and beside each name, a date, an examination, and a result. Ruth read it slowly, by lantern light, and as she read, she began to understand that her mother had done something even larger and quieter than teaching a county to read. She had put them through. 40 men and women who had been pulled out of school young. The way she had been, she had not only taught them their letters, she had carried them all the way. She had prepared them, at that little desk, for the 8th grade examination the state used to require, and later for the high school equivalency, sitting up nights with grown adults over arithmetic and civics and composition. She had driven them, some of them, 2 counties over to sit the exam because they had no car and were too proud to ask anyone but her. She had paid the testing fees. Ruth found those receipts too, folded into the ledger, signed the same 2 words. And beside each of the 40 names, in ink added later, sometimes years later, her mother had noted what became of them. Ruth read the notes, and the room seemed to fill up around her. Number 9, a Renfrew, could not read at 31, passed his equivalency in 1964, now runs the feed store, teaches his grandchildren their letters himself. Number 17, a girl named Suggs, the nearsighted one with the eyeglasses, passed in 1969, went to nursing school in Nashville, came home, was the county's only nurse for 20 years. Number 22, a Boyd, a hard case. Her mother had written, 3 years to get him to stay in his seat, now farms 400 acres and sits on the school board. Number 29, Elias Cobb, Ruth's breath caught, kept our post office 41 years and never once let on. And number 6, a boy named Pyle, the one who had held his primer an inch from his nose until a stranger bought him glasses. Samuel Pyle went to college, then to medical school on a church scholarship, and his own 2 hands, came home in 1978, is our doctor now, and does not know, I think, that the glasses were from me. There were others she read by lantern light and had to stop over. Number 2, a woman named Rennick, the nearsighted girl from the pencil note of 1957, passed her 8th grade examination in 1961 at the age of 19, having quit at 11, kept books for the co-op 40 years, her mother had written, and never made a wrong entry. Number 11, a Tolliver, the boy with no coat, passed in 1965, preaches now at the church with the new metal roof, and reads the whole book aloud without stumbling. Number 31, a man Cora had noted only as would not come in the door for a month, stood in the yard and listened through the window, passed in 1972, county road foreman, retired. Beside a few of the 40, there was no note at all, only the name and the date and the result, and Ruth understood those too. They had passed and gone, and her mother had lost track of them, and had left the line blank rather than guess, because she would not write down a thing she did not know for certain, even in a secret ledger meant for no one. Cora Dunmore had refused to exaggerate her own goodness. Half of them. Half the 40 were the men and women who now ran Verbena, its nurse, its doctor, its farmers, its feed store owner, its board members. And at number 34, in her mother's plainest hand, with no flourish at all, Ruth read, Odell Rourke, could not read at 26. Ashamed to sign for his own truck. Passed his equivalency in 1971. Is our mayor now. The mayor of Verbena had learned to read in this room, at night, from Ruth's mother, and had had his shoes and his testing fees paid for by a woman who signed herself a friend. Ruth closed the ledger and sat with her hand flat on the cover for a long time. She understood now what her mother had meant. The rest is yours to keep or to give. Cora had left her daughter a fortune, but not the kind Dale could void in a courtroom, and not the kind a person kept. She had left her the truth of what had happened in that room and the choice of what to do with it. Ruth drove into town the next morning and laid the black ledger on the counter of the post office in front of Elias Cobb. She watched the old man read his own name at number 29. She watched him put his glasses on and take them off and put them on again. And she watched a 40-year-old debt he had carried in silence turn, at last, into something he was allowed to set down. He read the whole list twice. Then he looked up at Ruth, and his voice was steady in a way it had not been the first day. "They're going to try to take it," Ruth said. "My brother-in-law. There's a developer, and a new road coming, and he says the will won't hold. He says a court will set it aside, say my mother wasn't of sound mind. He wants me to sign it over quiet so nobody has to hear those things said about her." She put her hand on the ledger. "I'm not going to." Elias Cobb looked at the list of 40 names for a long moment. Then he said, "No, I don't expect you are." He reached under the counter for the telephone. "You mind if I make some calls?" What the old man did over the next 3 weeks, Ruth only pieced together afterward, because he did it the quiet way, the way it had all been done. He drove out in the evenings in his old truck to farmhouses where men his age sat on porches, and he told them, some of them for the first time in 50 years, that he had learned to read at the Hollow Road School at 40, and asked them, plainly, where they had learned. He carried the black ledger with him, wrapped in a feed sack on the seat, and he let them find their own names in it, or their fathers' names, or the name of a wife long dead, and he did not have to say much after that. He was not organizing a mob. He was doing arithmetic, the same arithmetic Cora had done, counting quietly through a county, name by name, until he had counted enough. Ruth would come into the post office and find, some mornings, a scrap of paper slid under the door with a name on it and a note in an unsteady hand. "I'll be there." "Tell her I'll be there." She kept them. There were 19 of them by the last week of July. The hearing was 3 weeks later, in the county courthouse in Verbena, a petition filed by Dale Halloran on behalf of the trust to set aside the will of Cora Dunmore for defective execution and want of testamentary capacity. Dale had a city firm behind him and a stack of exhibits, and the Ridgeline offer folded in his breast pocket like a thing already won. He had done this 100 times. He expected an empty gallery and a tired judge and a sad, broke woman with no lawyer, and for the first 10 minutes that is exactly what he had. Then the doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and Verbena came in. They came in slowly, the old part of the town, Elias, Cobb's age and up, in their church clothes on a Tuesday. They filled the gallery, and then they filled the walls, standing, until the bailiff stopped trying to seat them. The feed store Renfrew came, and old Mrs. Suggs, who had been the county nurse, and a dozen Boyds, and a stooped, brown-handed crowd of farmers who had left their fields in July to be there. Dr. Samuel Pyle came in his white coat straight from the clinic. And last of all, in no hurry, came a broad old man in a gray suit, whom the whole room stood a little straighter for, and the judge said, "Morning, Odell," and Mayor Odell Rourke said, "Your Honor," and sat down in the front row. Dale looked at the gallery, and something in his face began, for the first time in Ruth's memory of him, to come loose. Ruth had no lawyer. She stood up when the judge asked if the respondent wished to be heard, and she said she did, and she did not argue the law, because she did not know the law. She simply asked the court's permission to read from a book. Then she opened the black ledger her mother had kept, those I have seen through, and she read the 40 names into the record, one at a time, with the dates and the notes beside them, in a plain, steady voice, in a courtroom where a third of the people present had learned to read the very words she was reading from the woman whose sanity was on trial. She read Elias, Cobb, post office, 41 years. She read the nurse and the doctor and the farmers. And when she came to number 34, she read it exactly as her mother had written it. Odell Rourke could not read at 26, ashamed to sign for his own truck, is our mayor now, and the old man in the gray suit put his face in his hands in the front row of the courthouse and did not care who saw. The judge asked, quietly, whether anyone present wished to speak to the character or the capacity of Cora Dunmore. One by one, they stood. They did not make speeches. They were not speech-making people. An old farmer stood and said, "She taught me to read at night and never took a cent, and I've got the mind God gave me, and I say she had hers to the day she died." Mrs. Suggs stood and held up a pair of eyeglasses and said, "She bought me these when I was 9 so I could see the board. Signed it a friend. We all got a friend story. Ask anybody standing up in here." Del Prentice, well, past 80 now, the hauler who had wanted to read his Bible, stood with his hat in both hands and said only, "I was 51 and I couldn't read a road sign. She started me at the letter A and she never once talked down to me. A woman that patient don't lose her mind. She had more mind than the rest of us put together." A farmer named Boyd, one of the ones who had re-roofed the schoolhouse's future without knowing it yet, stood and said his father had walked 4 miles to that school as a boy because somebody saw he got there, and that he had grown up hearing his father say Cora Dunmore's name the way other men said grace. The room did not shout. It did something quieter and worse for Dale. It simply testified, plainly, one plain voice after another, to a life so far outside the reach of the word incompetent that the word began to look obscene lying there on Dale's table. Dale rose once to object, and the judge looked at him, and Dale sat back down and did not rise again. The Ridgeline offer stayed folded in his pocket. He never took it out. There was no one in that room to sell it to. The judge upheld the will. He did it in a few dry sentences about the sufficiency of the witnessing and the clear and abundant evidence of the testatrix's capacity, and the dry sentences did not begin to hold what had happened in the room, but they held enough. The Hollow Road School and the 11 acres, and whatever the state's new road would one day make them worth, belonged to Ruth Dunmore Halloran, free and clear. Dale packed his exhibits in silence. On his way out, he stopped at Ruth's table, and for a moment she thought he would say something cruel, out of habit, because cruelty was the only language he had ever spoken to her in. But he only looked at her, and at the black ledger under her hand, and whatever he saw there seemed to tire him. "You could have had $80,000, he said. It was not a threat anymore. It was almost a question, as though he genuinely could not understand what she had chosen instead. "I know," Ruth said. "I've got something better." He did not ask what. He would not have understood the answer, and Ruth found, to her own surprise, that she no longer needed him to. He walked out of the courthouse into the July heat and got into his black car and drove the 3 hours back to the city, and Ruth never saw him again. She heard, much later, that the Ridgeline Company built its development somewhere else, and that the new road, when it finally came through, was routed with a curve in it at the county's request, so that it passed the Hollow Road School at a respectful distance and did not touch the field. Ruth did not sell. She had thought she might have to, those first weeks, down to $280 with a bad car and a good coat. But the town would not let her, and the town, it turned out, had been waiting 30 years for a reason. It began the Saturday after the hearing, when 11 trucks came up Hollow Road in the morning and did not leave until dark. The feed store Renfrew brought lumber at cost and then forgot to send the bill. 2 of the Boyd men re-roofed the whole building in a weekend and would not hear of pay. Dr. Pyle came out on a Sunday and, being no carpenter, spent the day pulling nails and carrying trash and, at noon, standing a long time in front of the strip of alphabet above the chalkboard without saying anything to anyone. The mayor sent the county's own crew to grade the road, and came himself, in old clothes, and worked a scraper down the smooth-worn center aisle where 38 years of children had walked, and where he had walked, at 26, ashamed to sign for his own truck. They came the second Saturday, too, and the third. Someone's wife brought a churn of lemonade and set it on a plank across 2 sawhorses, and it stayed there all summer, refilled by hands Ruth never caught in the act. A retired glazier out of the county seat drove 40 minutes each way, 3 weekends running, to cut and set new glass in the 12/12 window sashes to match the 4 old panes that had somehow survived, and would take only gas money, and only that because Ruth pressed it on him. Dr. Pyle sent, anonymously and then not anonymously, because the town was through with anonymous, a check that cleared the 11 years of back taxes the county had let ride, $419, and when Ruth tried to thank him, he waved it off and said a woman had once bought him a pair of eyeglasses and never let him say thank you either, so he supposed it ran in the family. They cleared the hackberry off the east wall and unboarded the windows and let the light back in. They rebuilt the belfry platform, freed the wood stove flue and blacked the stove, fixed the pump, and replaced the rope in the belfry with a new one. Somebody found the old bell. It had been in a Boyd barn for 30 years, taken down for safekeeping when the school closed and never given back, and they hung it in the belfry again, and the first time it rang, on a still evening in August, Ruth stood in the yard with her hand over her mouth and Chalk barking at the sound, and half the town, 3 miles away in Verbena, stopped what they were doing to listen. They reopened the Hollow Road School the following spring. Not as a county school. The county had its consolidated brick building out by the highway now, with its buses and its gymnasium. They reopened it as what Cora Dunmore had really made it, in secret after the children went home. A reading room. Ruth, who had been a substitute teacher for 34 years and had thought that part of her life was over, put a notice in the Bluebird and the feed store and the post office that anyone in Cade County who could not read, or read poorly, or wanted to read better, was welcome at the Hollow Road School on Tuesday and Thursday nights, that there was no cost, and that no one would ever be asked how they had come to be 40 years old and unable to read their own mail. They came. Not many. The first night, 3, and one of them left before the end. But they came, and word went the quiet way it goes in a county like that, and by the fall there were 9, and Ruth taught them at the little iron desks the way her mother had, starting each one where they were, which for some of them was nowhere, and never once letting them feel ashamed. Elias Cobb came every Tuesday and Thursday. Not to learn. He read fine now, had for 60 years, but to sit at the back and help, and to make the coffee. And because, he said, a man had to have somewhere to go. He was the one who suggested the ledger. So Ruth began a new one, black-bound like her mother's, and on the first page she wrote, in her own hand, which was not looping like Cora's but was steady, "Those I have seen through," and under it she wrote the first new name, and the date, and left the last column blank for later, for the notes on what would become of them. She framed a few of the receipts and hung them along the cloakroom wall, beside the false chalkboard door she left standing open now. The shoes, the eyeglasses, the school lunches, every one signed a friend, so that the people who came to learn would know that someone had done this once, quietly, at great cost, and had asked for nothing, and that the room they were sitting in had been paid for in a currency the Ridgeline Company had never heard of. She kept the little brown shoes on the teacher's chair. She never did find out whose they had been, but she thought she understood them now, and every morning when she came in she moved them, gently, to the windowsill, and set them back on the chair each night, the way you keep a promise you did not make but chose to inherit. Ruth lived in a small rented house in town after that, but she was at the schoolhouse most evenings, and on the warm ones she sat on the mended steps when the lesson was done, with Chalk, gray and stiff and content beside her, and watched the light go long and gold across the field where the road would one day curve to keep its distance. She was 62, and then 63. She had $310 once, and a suitcase, and a marriage that had eaten her, and a man who had taught her that the word worthless was the most expensive lie he had ever told. She had more than that now. She had a room full of light and the names of people learning to read in it, and a mother she had not truly known until the woman was 2 winters dead, and the strange late knowledge that a life could be measured, in the end, not by what was taken from you, but by what you managed, quietly, against every reason, to pass down the line. Her mother had graded a whole county once, morning after morning, marks and small O's in a careful hand. But that had never been the work. The work had been the nights. The work had been the shoes, and the eyeglasses, and the 40 names, and the woman at the front of a cold room who would not take your money, and would not let you feel ashamed, and would not, ever, let you go without. Some teachers grade you once. The best ones carry you for life. Ruth rang the bell each evening when the lesson was done, the way her mother must have, and let the sound go out over the fields toward the town, and the town, hearing it, remembered, all at once, and for the first time out loud, exactly who had paid for its shoes.